It begins like so many others. A quiet night, the hum of tires against the asphalt, the rhythmic pulse of streetlights casting fleeting shadows. Then, red and blue flood the darkness, a sudden shift. The air tightens, a moment that feels ordinary, yet is anything but. The police cruiser idles behind an expensive SUV, its dark-tinted windows concealing the unknown. A figure sits motionless inside, waiting. But the officer? He doesn't see a person. He sees a threat. His fingers twitch near his holster before his mind has time to process why. A deep breath. The officer steps out, his boots pressing against the cold pavement. Every nerve in his body is taut, coiled like a spring. The training, the instincts, the silent, conditioned fears. They all whisper the same thing. Control the situation. Assert dominance. But the question lingers. Why does he already feel the need to take command? The SUV remains still, its presence alone unsettling. The officer's hand hovers over his firearm. He hasn't seen the driver's face, hasn't heard a word spoken. Yet something inside him signals danger. A bias unspoken, unconscious, but alive. A rap on the window. Slow, deliberate. The glass slides down with eerie smoothness, revealing the man inside. Calm, composed, no panic, no confusion. Just an unwavering, unreadable gaze. It is the kind of stillness that unsettles, the kind of presence that forces a man to examine himself. The officer doesn't speak at first. He simply stares, waiting for the other to break the silence. License and registration. The command is sharp, mechanical, an echo of protocol. Yet beneath it lies something else. A weight. A suspicion he can't quite name. The man inside nods, his movement measured, deliberate. His hands are slow, controlled, the way a man moves when he knows sudden gestures could cost him everything. He reaches toward the glove compartment. Instantly, the officer's hand goes to his weapon. Fear surges. His pulse pounds. His mind floods with possibilities, all of them dark. The images of past encounters, of news headlines, of perceived threats turned fatal, all play like a reel behind his eyes. He doesn't think. He reacts. Stop! Hands where I can see them. The words slice through the night, laced with urgency, with something dangerously close to panic. The gun is drawn now, pointed, rigid. The space between them, once tense, has become lethal. But the man in the SUV does not flinch. His hands freeze mid-motion, fingers inches from the glove compartment. And then, he speaks. Officer, do you know who I am? The question hangs, lingering, pressing. It is not a plea. It is not fear. It is something else entirely. A calm so absolute, so unshaken, that it forces the officer to hesitate. The certainty in the man's voice, the unwavering confidence, these are not the responses of a man who fears for his life. The officer swallows. His mind races. He should be in control. He should dictate the situation. Yet, in this moment, control is slipping. License, registration, now. The demand is repeated, but this time, it falters. There's an edge of uncertainty in his tone now, an undercurrent of doubt he cannot suppress. And then, in silence, the man inside the SUV moves again. Slow, precise, as though choreographed by some unseen force. He opens the glove compartment, retrieves a badge, and holds it up to the flashing lights. The reflection catches the officer's eyes, and in that instant, the world shifts. A name, a rank, a truth that dismantles the entire narrative the officer had constructed in his mind. United States Army General. A man who has served, led, commanded forces far beyond the officer's jurisdiction. A man whose very presence demands respect. The officer's grip falters, but he does not lower his gun. He cannot. His entire framework of authority, of understanding who holds power in this moment, is collapsing in real time. The illusion of dominance shatters, leaving only raw, unsettling realization. The general's eyes do not waver. He does not move, does not reach for anything else. He simply watches, as if waiting for the inevitable. The officer exhales, sharp and uneasy. The power dynamic has inverted. He is no longer in control, if he ever truly was. The silence stretches, thick with unspoken truths. "You didn't see a soldier," the general finally says, voice low, deliberate. "You saw a threat." The words cut deep, striking something the officer doesn't want to name. He stands there, weapon still raised, but his world tilting beneath him. A moment of tension, now transformed into something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. A reckoning. The silence between them is thick, like the charged air before a storm. The officer's fingers tighten around the grip of his weapon, his mind wrestling between protocol and instinct, between what he believes he knows and the uncertainty pressing in around him. The man in the driver's seat doesn't flinch, doesn't beg, doesn't even blink. He simply exhales, slow and steady, the kind of breath that belongs to someone who has stood in the face of death before and never once bowed to fear. Then, with the weight of 1,000 battles behind his voice, he speaks. "Do you know who I am?" The question is a quiet thunderclap, reverberating in the hollow space between them. It is not asked with arrogance, not with defiance, but with something far more unsettling, certainty. A certainty that does not yield, does not tremble, does not ask for permission. The officer hesitates. His training has taught him that control is everything, that power belongs to the one who dictates the pace of an encounter. Yet, in this moment, he feels control slipping through his fingers like sand. This isn't how it's supposed to go. The suspect should be compliant, submissive, nervous. But this man, he is none of those things. Instead, he moves. Slow, deliberate, every motion infused with an unspoken warning. Watch closely. See what you've missed. His hand reaches for the center console, fingers brushing against the edge. The officer stiffens, gun raised, a command forming in his throat, but before he can speak, before he can make another mistake, the man stops. A pause, a glance, a moment heavy with meaning. Then, he pulls out his identification and slides it toward the officer, letting the small leather wallet come to rest under the glare of the flashing lights. The officer's eyes flick downward, scanning the insignia embossed in gold, the words stamped with finality, with history, with power that dwarfs his own. United States Army. Not just an officer. Not just enlisted. A general. A man who has commanded soldiers across battlefields, who has stood in war zones where the rules are written in blood, who has held the lives of men in his hands and carried the weight of decisions that no civilian could ever comprehend. The breath catches in the officer's throat. The gun in his hands suddenly feels heavier, as if burdened by the weight of its own hypocrisy. A badge gleams beneath the ID, one that represents the very nation he has sworn to protect, the very ideals he claims to uphold. And yet, here he stands, his weapon drawn on a man who has spent his life serving that same nation. A man who, by rank alone, has more authority than he could ever hope to achieve. The realization strikes like a hammer to glass. Everything he thought he knew about this moment, about this encounter, shatters. He had seen a black man behind the wheel of an expensive car, and before reason could intervene, assumptions filled in the gaps. He had seen a suspect, a potential threat, a statistic waiting to be written. But now, confronted with the truth, the foundation of his perception crumbles beneath him. This is no ordinary traffic stop. This is no ordinary man. For the first time since the flashing light split the night, the officer's hands begin to tremble. The general watches him, eyes sharp, unreadable. He doesn't need to say anything more. The badge, the rank, the lifetime of service etched into his face, these speak louder than any words ever could. But still, the question lingers in the air, unspoken, yet deafening. Would you have hesitated if I looked different? If my uniform was visible? If you had known who I was from the start? The officer feels the unspoken accusation settle onto his shoulders like lead. He wants to defend himself, to say that he was just following protocol, that he was only being cautious, that his instincts were justified. But even as the thoughts form, He knows they are empty. Because the truth is undeniable. If it had been a white man behind the wheel, the gun would have never left its holster. The realization is sickening. Not because he is surprised by it, but because deep down, he already knew. For years he has worn a badge that granted him authority. A badge that told him he was here to serve and protect. A badge that, in his mind, set him apart from the corrupt, from the reckless, from the prejudiced enforcers that tarnish the reputation of the uniform. And yet tonight, that same badge has become a mirror, reflecting back something he cannot ignore. The general sees it too. Not just in this officer, but in every man like him. Every authority figure who has let fear, bias, and the illusion of power dictate their actions. Slowly, deliberately, the general reaches forward, resting a single finger on the edge of his ID, and pushes it closer. A reminder. A lesson. A challenge. The officer stares down at it, his mind unraveling, his grip loosening. He has pulled a gun on a man who has commanded battalions, who has walked foreign soil as both protector and warrior, who has sacrificed more for his country than he could ever claim to understand. And yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. Because before he saw the title, before he saw the rank, before he saw the truth, he saw only a black man in the dark. The weight of that knowledge presses down on him, suffocating. The general doesn't break eye contact. He doesn't demand an apology. He doesn't need to, because regret is not enough. Recognition is not enough. The question now is, what comes next? And that, the officer realizes, is an answer only he can give. A concept so deeply embedded in the fabric of civilization that few ever stop to question it. A symbol worn like armor, a rank spoken like a spell, a badge wielded like a shield. But what happens when authority meets its own contradiction? When the very power that grants control is rendered powerless in the presence of something greater? He has fought for his country, bled for its ideals, risked his life so that others may stand freely. He has earned respect, not through fear, not through force, but through sacrifice. And yet, here, in the cold silence of this confrontation, none of it matters. His medals do not grant him safety. His service does not absolve him of suspicion. His rank does not shield him from the weight of another man's assumptions. The irony is unbearable. A decorated army general, trained to command, to lead, to make life or death decisions in the heat of battle, yet reduced to a nameless threat in the eyes of a man who holds no rank above him, no greater authority, no higher claim to power. The badge on the officer's chest shines in the flickering light. But in this moment, it is nothing more than an illusion. The power it represents is fragile, empty, meaningless when stripped of the fear that sustains it. Authority is a paradox. Society teaches that power belongs to those who wear the uniform, those who bear the insignia, those who uphold the law. And yet, the very foundation of that power crumbles when challenged by something it does not control. What is a badge when it is confronted by a higher authority? What is an officer when he stands before a soldier who has bled on foreign soil for the very nation he claims to serve? The contrast is stark. The military and the police, two forces that operate under the same flag, yet move in opposite directions. One exists to defend the nation from external threats. The other polices its own. One is forged in battle, where life and death are real, where actions have consequences that echo beyond a single moment. The other thrives in the gray space of power unchecked, where a uniform alone is enough to justify force. It is an ancient question, one that echoes through time. Who truly holds power? Is it the one who can wield violence without consequence? Or is it the one who understands that true authority is not taken? It is earned. Plato wrestled with this in the Republic, where the nature of justice was laid bare, dissected, debated. Is justice merely the advantage of the stronger? A tool used by those in power to maintain their rule? Or is there something more? A force beyond laws and symbols? Something rooted in wisdom, rather than force? And if justice is simply a game of power, then what happens when the rules are revealed to be a lie? Here, in this moment, power is exposed for what it truly is. The officer, gun in hand, believes himself to be in control. He has been taught that his authority is absolute, that compliance is not requested but demanded. But he is no longer facing a civilian. He is facing a man who has walked through war. A man who has commanded others not out of fear, but out of respect. A man who does not need a weapon to assert his presence, because his very existence, his very record, speaks louder than any drawn gun. And suddenly, the officer feels small. For the first time, the authority granted to him by his badge feels weightless in his hands. He is standing before a man who represents everything he has been conditioned to respect: duty, sacrifice, leadership. And yet, when he first saw him, when he first felt the pulse of fear push his hand toward his weapon, he did not see any of those things. He saw something else. A black man. A suspect. A threat. The realization is a slow, creeping thing, spreading through him like a sickness he cannot shake. His own reflection stares back at him from the polished surface of the general's ID. The truth he cannot escape. He has been wielding power he never earned. He has been using a badge to justify control. But now, standing in the presence of true authority, he is forced to confront a question he has spent his entire career avoiding. Do we respect power, or do we fear it? Because fear is the currency of weak authority. It is the tool used by those who cannot command respect. The officer knows this, has seen it in others, but he never thought, never once considered, that he might be guilty of it himself. But how could he not be? He has spent years inside a system that rewards dominance, that conflates control with justice, that teaches men like him that hesitation is weakness, that the uniform alone is enough to demand obedience. And yet, here he stands, his own authority crumbling under the weight of something real. The general has not threatened him. He has not raised his voice, has not moved with aggression, has not done anything to justify the weapon still trembling in the officer's hands. And yet, the officer feels as though he is losing. Because power, the kind he has relied on, is an illusion. It exists only as long as others believe in it. But the man before him does not. He has seen real power. He has witnessed it in the trenches, in the eyes of soldiers who follow orders not out of fear, but out of trust. He has led men into battle knowing that leadership is not a rank, not a title. It is something deeper, something earned through action, through sacrifice, through unwavering integrity. And that is why he does not cower. That is why he does not yield. Because this moment is not about power. It is about truth. The general watches the officer carefully, studying him in silence, waiting. He is not waiting for an apology. He is waiting to see what the officer will do with this moment of clarity. Waiting to see if he will retreat back into the comfort of his badge, or if he will acknowledge what has just been laid bare before him. The irony of power is this: those who need it most often wield it the worst. And those who do not seek it, who do not crave control over others, are the ones most deserving of it. The officer has spent years believing himself to be a figure of authority. But now he understands. He is not in control here. Because true power is not about fear. True power is about knowing that fear does not define you. And in that realization, he begins to see, not just the man before him, but himself. And for the first time, he is afraid. Not of the man in the car. Not of the consequences of this moment. But of the truth he can never unsee. The weight of the moment settles like a stone in his chest. His grip loosens, the tension in his fingers releasing, but the damage is already done. The weapon that had once felt like an extension of his authority now feels foreign, heavy with the burden of what it represents. He swallows hard, the realization creeping in, slow and merciless. He had drawn his gun on a man who had given more to this country than he ever would. A man whose uniform carried the weight of real sacrifice. A man who, in every conceivable way, had earned the respect the officer believed his own badge commanded. And yet, in that instant, none of it had mattered. The general watches him, his expression unreadable. He does not speak immediately, does not lash out, does not demand an apology. He doesn't need to. The silence between them is already suffocating. The truth is hanging in the air, thick and undeniable. The officer wants to justify himself, wants to say that he was only following protocol, that he was trained to react this way, that he didn't know. But what stops him, what keeps the words locked behind clenched teeth, is the terrifying truth that none of those excuses would be enough. Not for the general, not for himself. Because the real problem isn't what happened in this moment. The problem is why it happened. The general exhales, slow and steady. And then, finally, he speaks. You didn't see a soldier. You saw a threat. The words strike deeper than any reprimand ever could. They are not shouted, not weaponized, not meant to humiliate, but that only makes them more devastating. The truth of them crashes over the officer like a wave, stripping him bare, exposing something ugly beneath the layers of duty and protocol he once believed protected him. Because the general is right. That is exactly what happened. For years, the officer had told himself that he was different from the others, that he was one of the good ones, that he didn't let race cloud his judgment, that he upheld the law fairly, that his badge stood for something more than just power. But tonight, all those illusions have been shattered. Because when faced with a moment of uncertainty, when given the choice between fear and reason, he had reached for his gun. Not because the general had threatened him, not because he had shown any sign of hostility, not because there had been any real danger, but because somewhere deep inside, buried beneath years of conditioning, a narrative had already been written before he even approached the car, a narrative that whispered, "Black man, late at night, expensive car, be ready." He had not seen the details. He had not registered the possibilities. He had not waited to understand. Because that's not how the system works. The system rewards suspicion. It rewards quick reactions. It rewards the instinct to assume the worst, to prepare for violence, to believe, without evidence, that danger wears a certain skin. And tonight, he had played his role perfectly. The realization is unbearable. It is not just the shame of this one moment. It is the weight of 1,000 moments before it, stretching back further than his own lifetime. How many times had this happened? How many times had men who looked like the general been treated as threats first, human beings second? How many officers had stood where he stood now, gun raised, fear in their eyes, ready to justify their actions before the trigger was even pulled? The worst part is that he knows how this night could have ended. It is an image he cannot force from his mind. A slight miscalculation. A misunderstanding. A moment of fear tipping too far. A shot fired. And then what? The media would have painted a picture. One carefully curated, expertly spun. Words like mistake, miscommunication, unfortunate incident would have softened the blow, would have shielded the truth from the public. The general's military record would have been a footnote, his achievements overshadowed by whatever narrative best justified the outcome. And the officer, he would have walked away. Not unscathed, not untouched, but not ruined. Not like the general's family would have been. Not like a man whose life would have been reduced to headlines and debates and protests that would eventually fade into nothing. That is the truth that makes him sick. Not just the guilt of what he almost did, but the knowledge that if he had done it, the system would have protected him, because that is what it was built to do. He lowers his gun completely now, though it hardly matters. He has already lost whatever moral high ground he thought he stood on. The man in front of him is not simply a victim of this one encounter. He is the product of centuries of encounters just like this, of a history that has repeated itself so many times, it has become ingrained in the very foundation of the world they live in. And yet, the general does not look at him with anger, disappointment perhaps, but not anger. Because this, too, is a pattern. The realization, the regret, the slow, painful reckoning that comes too late to undo the damage already done. The officer wants to say something, but he knows there are no words that can fix this. An apology feels meaningless. A promise to do better feels hollow. Because this is not about one man's mistake. This is about an entire system that thrives on mistakes like these. That depends on men like him to follow their instincts, to react out of fear, to never question why they saw a threat instead of a human being. And he knows, in his heart, that regret alone is not enough. Regret does not rewrite history. Regret does not bring back the lives lost to the same moment of hesitation, the same unconscious bias, the same hand reaching too quickly for a gun. Regret is useless without change. The general studies him for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of the realization settling inside him. Then, with the same calm that has defined every moment of this encounter, he reaches for his ID, takes it back, and tucks it away. He does not lecture. He does not demand, because he knows the truth just as well as the officer does. This moment will not be judged by what has already happened. It will be judged by what happens next. History is not just the past. It is the foundation upon which the present stands, the unseen force that shapes every moment, every action, every unspoken bias. To understand why this night unfolded the way it did, one must look beyond the flashing lights, beyond the raised gun, beyond even the regret that now lingers in the air. One must look back, to the echoes of a time when power was not just enforced by law, but by the weight of a system built to maintain control. Policing in America did not begin as a noble profession. It did not rise from a place of justice, of fairness, of duty to all. It was born in the shadows of slavery, in the iron grip of those who saw human lives as property. The first law enforcement institutions in the United States were slave patrols, armed men tasked with hunting down those who dared to escape the chains that bound them. Their job was not protection. It was punishment, not service, but subjugation. The Fugitive Slave Acts of the 18th and 19th centuries gave these patrols legal authority to seize, detain, and return any black person accused, often without proof, of being an escaped slave. Free men were stolen from their homes, their families, their lives, and dragged back into servitude, their freedom erased with the stroke of a pen. This was not an era of mistaken identities or unfortunate errors. This was law. This was order. This was justice, as it was written then. The Civil War came. Slavery was abolished. But systems do not die so easily. They evolve. The black codes of the Reconstruction era ensured that the newly freed were never truly free. Loitering was a crime. Unemployment was a crime. Vagrancy was a crime. And law enforcement, now reshaped, rebranded, but not reformed, became the tool by which black men were arrested en masse and forced into prison labor. The badge did not protect them. It was a weapon used against them. Jim Crow deepened the divide. Segregation ensured that even in uniform, a black officer was never truly an officer. In the early 1900s, black men were allowed to serve as police officers in some states, but their authority was a farce. They could wear the badge, enforce the law, but only against those who looked like them. White citizens were untouchable, immune to the very system that claimed to serve justice. A black officer who dared to arrest a white man would be stripped of his uniform, humiliated, punished, not by criminals, but by his own department. And so, the lesson was learned. The law did not serve black men. It controlled them. World War I, World War II. Black soldiers fought and died on foreign soil, defending a nation that refused to defend them. They returned home with medals pinned to their chests, only to be greeted with hostility, with suspicion, with the same tired reminder that no matter their sacrifice, they would never be seen as equals. Lynch mobs did not care about military service. The police did not protect them. A black soldier in uniform was not a hero. He was a challenge to the status quo, a walking contradiction to the belief that power, dignity, and honor did not belong to men who looked like him. And so, they were beaten, spat on, murdered, their names forgotten by the same country they had bled for. The officer standing on this road tonight is not the first to draw his weapon on a black veteran. This moment is not unique. It is the weight of centuries pressing down, repeating itself over and over again, because the cycle has never truly been broken. The 1960s came, and with them, the civil rights movement. Marches, sit-ins, protests, and always, police in riot gear, batons raised, dogs unleashed, fire hoses drowning the cries for justice. The men in uniform did not see citizens demanding their rights. They saw threats. The same story. The same fear. The same hand reaching for the weapon before the mind has time to question why. The war on drugs. The rise of mass incarceration. The 1990s. The 2000s. The present. Different words. Different laws. But the same result. A system that has never stopped treating black men as suspects first, human beings second. And so, the question lingers. How could it be any different tonight? The officer who pulled the trigger in 1923. The one who turned his fire hose on children in 1965. The one who placed his knee on a man's neck in 2020. Did they feel regret? Did they tell themselves they were only doing their jobs? Did they too have a moment where they saw themselves reflected in the shattered glass of their own actions? Regret is a fragile thing when it is not followed by change. The general knows this. He has seen it before. Perhaps in his own life, in his own experience with those who saluted his rank, but not his skin. Perhaps in the faces of fellow soldiers who fought beside him, only to return home to a country that did not see their uniform, did not see their sacrifice, only their color. He has seen men just like the officer before him. Men who wear the badge believing they stand for justice, believing they are different from those who came before them. And yet, when faced with the unknown, when standing at the crossroads of power and prejudice, they make the same choice. A hand on the gun. A demand for submission. A moment of fear justified by a lifetime of conditioning. And now, the cycle stands before them both, waiting. This moment is not just about a single mistake. It is not just about one officer, one general, one night on an empty road. It is about a system designed long before either of them was born. A system that has never been dismantled, only repainted to look more palatable. History does not repeat itself. It is repeated by those who refuse to learn from it. And so the question is not whether this night will be remembered. The question is whether it will change anything at all. Fear is ancient. It is older than language, older than civilization, older than the very structures that define the world. It is primal, woven into the core of human existence, shaping actions long before the mind has time to comprehend them. Fear is the whisper in the dark, the tightening of the chest, the instinct to run before the predator strikes. It is a survival mechanism, one that has kept humanity alive for millennia. But what happens when fear is no longer a tool for survival, but a weapon for control? The human brain does not wait for reason. In the first 200 milliseconds of seeing a stranger, it has already made a decision. Safe or dangerous, friend or foe. The amygdala, the seat of fear and emotion, fires before logic has a chance to intervene. It does not ask for truth. It does not care about facts. It reacts to patterns, to the stories it has been fed, to the echoes of history disguised as instinct. And so, the officer's gun was not drawn in a moment of rational thought. It was drawn in the space before reason. In the gap between perception and reality, where bias lives, where fear festers. Because fear is not always real. But its consequences are. What defines a threat? Is it the presence of danger? Or the perception of it? If a man in uniform can fight for his country, risk his life, prove his worth 1,000 times over, only to be seen as dangerous the moment he steps outside the battlefield, then what does that say about the nature of fear? This is not just about one man, one officer, one mistake. It is about a system that has taught people what to fear, who to fear, and when to react. A system that does not need facts or reason, because it has something far more powerful: the illusion of certainty. Implicit bias is not conscious. It is not a choice. It is a program running beneath awareness, influencing decisions, shaping outcomes, ensuring that some people will always be seen as threats, no matter what they have done or who they are. The media does not help. For decades, it has played its part, feeding the cycle, reinforcing the fear. Black men as criminals, black men as suspects, black men as aggressors. The same images, repeated over and over until they are no longer questioned, only believed. The brain absorbs the pattern, learns the association, responds without hesitation. And so, the officer's fear was never his own. It was inherited. Passed down through generations, through history books, through laws written to justify it. He was not the first to feel it. He will not be the last. But this is where the deception deepens. Because fear is not just a reaction, it is a tool. A system built on power cannot afford to let people see the world clearly. It must shape perception, mold instinct, dictate who is seen as strong and who is seen as weak, who is given authority and who is stripped of it, who is feared and who is respected. And so, one unsettling truth emerges. What if the greatest deception is that we are made to fear those we should respect, and respect those we should fear? What if history has reversed the roles, painted the protectors as predators and the predators as protectors? What if the very structures that claim to serve and defend have, all along, been the architects of fear? The officer holds his gun, but now he does not trust his own hand. He does not trust his own instincts, because for the first time he sees them for what they are, not his, but something placed inside him long before he had a choice. And if his fear is not real, if it has been manufactured, manipulated, then what else has he been blind to? The answer is more terrifying than fear itself. The weight of the moment does not fade. It lingers. It grows. It tightens around his chest, pressing down with the weight of something he cannot name, something he cannot escape. He had always believed in his duty, in the laws he swore to uphold, in the simple, unshakable truth that the badge on his chest made him one of the good ones. But now, standing here, gun still lowered, mind unraveling, he is forced to ask himself a question he never expected. What if he has not been serving justice? What if he has been serving something else entirely? The thought is foreign, unsettling. He had never questioned his role before, had never needed to. The system was the system, and he had been taught that his job was to enforce it, to carry out orders without hesitation, to trust in the rules that shaped his world. But tonight, those rules have betrayed him. The illusion of power is crumbling. Because if power were real, then why does he feel so small? If the system were just, then why does he feel like a man who has just looked into a mirror and seen someone he does not recognize? His mind cycles through every excuse, every justification, every training manual, but none of them can explain away the truth standing in front of him. He had not drawn his gun because he was in danger. He had not drawn his gun because the man before him had done anything wrong. He had drawn his gun because something inside him, something deeper than reason, had told him to. And now, that voice has gone silent. For the first time he sees himself for what he truly is, not an enforcer of law, not a protector of people, just a man who was given power before he ever understood what it meant, a man who had mistaken authority for righteousness, control for justice, fear for instinct. The general watches him, waiting, not for an apology, not for justification. He waits for something far more difficult, something far more painful. He waits for the officer to understand. And when he does, when the truth finally settles into his bones, it is not anger that follows. It is not rage or defiance or even sorrow. It is something worse. It is the quiet, hollow ache of knowing that he has been blind all along. Because if he was wrong about this, if his instincts were not his own, if his training had led him to this moment, to this mistake, then what else has he been wrong about? He exhales, long and slow, the weight of it pressing against his ribs. There is no undoing what has happened. There is no erasing the choice he made tonight. No way to step back into the ignorance he once wore like armor. The general does not say another word. He does not need to. He simply takes his ID, tucks it away, and turns the key in the ignition. The engine hums to life, steady, unmoved. And then, just like that, he is gone. The officer stands there, frozen in the silence he no longer knows how to fill. The flashing lights still cast their eerie glow, but they no longer feel like a symbol of authority. they feel like an accusation. He watches the SUV disappear into the distance, swallowed by the night, and for the first time in his life, he feels truly alone. Not because he is standing on an empty road, not because the moment has passed, but because the world he once believed in no longer exists. Because he now knows that power is not justice, that law is not always truth, that what he was taught to fear may not have been the threat at all. The badge on his chest feels heavier than it ever has, and for the first time, he wonders if it was ever really his to wear. The night does not end with answers, it ends with questions. The kind that linger in the mind long after the moment has passed. The kind that unravel everything once believed to be certain. Because this was never just about one man, one officer, one decision. This was about the hidden forces that shape perception, the silent systems that dictate who is seen as powerful and who is seen as a threat. It was about the illusion of authority, the kind that demands obedience, not respect. The kind that thrives on fear rather than understanding. And so, the question remains, what does it mean to serve, to protect? If justice is only enforced for some, is it justice at all? If power is maintained through fear, is it strength or is it weakness? The truth is not comfortable. It never is. Because to see clearly, one must be willing to admit they were blind. And to awaken, one must be willing to act. Regret is not enough. Awareness is not enough. Because knowledge without change is just another form of complicity. So the real question is not whether this night will be remembered. The real question is whether it will matter. Or if, like so many nights before it, it will simply fade into history, repeating itself once again.